Hello, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're doing good. So today I wanted to talk about something that I feel is very important for scapegoats of narcissistic family systems, especially as we get older, and that's addressing our learned self-neglect with regards to our physical health. I've mentioned in previous videos that my mother is obsessed with her own illness, both real and imagined, and I spent my life pandering to her hypochondria, providing her with unquestioning sympathy and attention, spending hours researching Google Scholar journals for explanations of symptoms that I knew deep down she didn't have. That "here's what's wrong with me today" text was simply a guaranteed hit of narc supply for this eternal victim, as well as ensuring I was consumed with panic and devoting all my time and energy to her instead of myself. Meanwhile, any time I was genuinely unwell and mentioned this to her, I'd be met with minimisation and one-upmanship. If I had a cold, she claimed to have the flu. If I had a broken leg, she claimed to have a spinal fracture. Her trump card, however, was her dad dying when she was a child. Any calamity in my life was immediately shot down with the all-too-familiar refrain, "So what? My dad died when I was 10. While it's of course tragic that her father died, it's something she's never worked through, deeming therapy as something only crazy lunatics like me pursue, and so something she has no use for. So it's something she's no intention of coming to terms with, even though his death from lung disease was so obviously the root cause of her fetishization of illness. I've mentioned previously how little concern or interest my narcs had in any medical crisis I endured after leaving home, refusing to visit me in hospital or provide even the slightest bit of support when I needed it, although I learned early in life to never ask them for help anyway. This lack of care or concern is something that was extended to other people too, my mother always having to win the affliction Olympics in her warped mind. No matter the seriousness or nature of a person's illness, she'd claim to have had it worse. I was therefore trained from an early age that my own physical health was unimportant. This doesn't mean that any illness I've had was not used by my narcs for their own advantage, however. While my parents showed no interest to me directly in situations where I was unwell, to the outside world they played the devoted martyrs, garnering delicious sympathy and narc supply, while not actually helping me. This martyrdom started very early in my life, when I was genuinely seriously ill as a toddler and required major surgery age 3. My mother lapped up the attention from doctors and the sympathy and concern provided by other people around her, and she milked my illness for her own benefit, while I was the one actually enduring invasive and painful treatments, with barely a comforting hug from her. Due to the nature of my illness, a benign tumour in my chest, I was on a ward of kids with cancer, who were significantly sicker than me, many dying during my time there. That time was actually my introduction to the concept of death, when I'd ask where a friend on the ward was, and my mother would give me the blunt and brutal answer as to why they weren't coming back, obviously making me terrified I'd be next. While my situation was serious, as soon as my tumour was removed the problem was solved, but I was forced to don the label of the poor, frail, sickly child for the rest of my childhood, being taken back and forth to the GP for years, my former registered nurse mother coaching me on how to describe symptoms of illnesses I didn't have, to further milk my initial real illness. One of the more disgusting parts of this debacle was my mother infiltrating a local special playgroup for the mothers of genuinely sick and disabled children. I'd be taken to these sessions to hang out with kids who were terminally ill or suffering from disabilities from which they would never recover, feeling like an imposter, while my mother regarded herself as equally, if not more, disadvantaged as the mothers dealing with legitimately overwhelming struggles. Bizarrely, when I had genuine medical needs, these were largely ignored, including a glaringly obvious eating disorder and self-harm that began when I was 12. Mundane, less glamorous, for want of a better word, medical issues were neglected. It wasn't until going no contact and freeing up mental bandwidth and time to look at my own health that I realised the extent of this neglect. One example of this was a long overdue trip to the dentist, where I was quizzed on why I'd never had braces, something that's been provided free or very low cost to children under the NHS for decades. I told the dentist that my golden child brother had braces as a preteen, but I never did, and I'd assumed I hadn't needed them, but learned this was not the case, and that it was guaranteed my parents would have been told as much, and it could have prevented the dental issues they developed in adulthood. I can only assume that this denial of braces was part of my mother's other attempts to intentionally sabotage my looks, as is a common behaviour of narc mums towards the daughters they grotesquely deemed to be rivals, even as children. As I spent more time working on my mental health following going no contact, another condition usually diagnosed in childhood came up, when my trauma therapist asked if I'd ever been assessed for autism as, in his opinion, I displayed signs. I thought back and I recalled a session with what I assume was a child psychologist when I was 5 or 6, which I'd always been told by my mother was an IQ test. And of course she crowed to the outside world that I had the best score the assessors had ever seen and I was a certified genius. In hindsight, I believe this was actually an autism test recommended by my teachers, and can only assume that the results were an embarrassment to my image-obsessed mother, and therefore any diagnosis was completely ignored, denying me support that I deserved, and which could have made my school years less traumatic. I'm therefore in the middle of the process of being assessed for both autism and ADHD in my mid-40s. After recently asking my GP for an overall health check, I also learned that my mother's assertions that I was doomed to inherit a laundry list of what I now know to be either fictional or simply lifestyle-related conditions were false. I realised I'd spent my life panicking about nothing, and I was completely fine. I'd always resigned myself to a miserable medical future, and as such this contributed to my many attempts to unalive myself. But I now know it's entirely possible for me to be a fit and active senior. These revelations made me wonder what other secrets had been kept about the realities of my childhood health, and any family medical history that had been hidden from me, and I'm in the process of investigating this. Us scapegoats have been trained to put the needs of the narcs above our own, often to the detriment of our physical and mental health. Many of us were never taught the basics of adulting, things like cooking and food safety, our parents intentionally infantilizing us to keep us dependent on them, dooming many of us to poor diets and low levels of self-care as adults, leading to poor health. For many scapegoat girls, we were on our own when it came to things like our first period. We learned about the birds and bees from Judy Blume books and playground chatter, and we were shamed by our narcs when we started to show romantic interest in pop stars and celebrities. We were trained to ignore symptoms of our illnesses, self-minimising and not making a fuss, often making matters worse due to delayed diagnosis. I mentioned in a previous video the time I had an accident and hurt my leg, going on to ignore the pain and power through for several days before giving in and going to the emergency room, where horrified doctors revealed my delay in seeking help meant I required major surgery. After going no contact and replenishing my energy reserves after decades of my narcs sucking the life out of me, I suddenly had the time and the self-esteem to make changes, like quitting alcohol, eating properly, and getting out in the fresh air for runs and long walks. I'd made many attempts in the past to address my lifelong restrictive eating disorder, but it wasn't till I realised the root cause of it, namely scapegoating abuse, I finally started to put it behind me. I'm finally prioritising myself and my future, and the positive knock-on effect on my mental health has been amazing. Your narcs may be struggling with their health, particularly ageing narcs, but it's not your responsibility to carry the burden of dealing with these, especially conditions that are the consequences of their poor choices. You owe these people nothing. It's important for you to start putting yourself first and realise that you matter. I've heard of scapegoats ignoring things like excruciating abdominal pain so as not to miss events their narcs demanded they attend, only to go on to collapse with what's revealed to be a near-fatal ruptured spleen or advanced appendicitis. At bare minimum, start checking yourself for lumps and bumps. Get any nagging coughs or changes in your poo investigated. Please attend every medical screening appointment you're invited to, and ask your GP for a general health assessment to get a good idea of any lifestyle changes you might need to make to ensure you won't run into any problems in the future. You are not wasting resources, and you deserve to enjoy good health. I'm ashamed to say my old attitude to my cervical smear invitations was, the universe would be doing me a favour if I got terminal cancer, so I'm not attending. Thankfully, I no longer feel that way. One of the reasons I relapsed into my eating disorder during the first lockdown was my classic scapegoat attitude towards supermarket shortages, namely that other people were more deserving of food than me. I'd felt similarly about NHS resources, delaying seeking help when I developed symptoms of the virus during this time, and ending up with asthma complications that could have been prevented. It's so sad to reflect on just how worthless I'd been trained to feel my life was, but I'm so happy I've turned this around. It's time for you to take a look at any maladaptive coping mechanisms you understandably might have adopted to cope with your narcs. Smoking, drinking too much, eating too much or too little, taking illicit substances, and overall self-neglect, and seek help and support to start addressing these. You matter, and you deserve a happy, healthy life. So it's time to reject the learned self-neglect programmed into you by your narcs and start embracing self-care. Go out and buy yourself that moisturiser, that smoothie maker, that fancy chocolate bar, or any other little pampering treat you've always denied yourself because of feeling you don't deserve it. You absolutely do deserve it. So with that, look after yourself, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.